World War I, the Western Front. The Western Front was defined by a 400-mile line of trenches stretching from the Swiss border to the North Sea. It was a stagnant, brutal landscape of mud, barbed wire, and no man's land. For the soldiers, life was a cycle of misery in the earth. Constant rain turned trenches into waist-deep bogs, leading to trench foot, where skin literally rotted off the bone. Rats and lice were constant companions, and the smell of decaying bodies in no man's land was inescapable. The defining horror of this front was industrialized death. For the first time, soldiers faced poison gas, chlorine and mustard gas that blinded eyes and blistered lungs. Massed artillery barrages lasted for days, causing shell shock, a level of psychological trauma never seen before. At battles like the Somme and Verdun, hundreds of thousands of men were sacrificed for a few yards of dirt. On the first day of the Somme alone, the British suffered nearly 60,000 casualties, the bloodiest day in their military history. The war ended in 1918 with an armistice, leaving behind a lost generation and a world forever changed by the sheer scale of the carnage. Total Western Front deaths: approximately 5 million soldiers. Key statistic: over 1 million combined casualties at the Battle of the Somme alone. World War II, the Eastern Front. The Eastern Front was the largest and deadliest military theater in history. Spanning over 1,000 miles from the Baltic to the Black Sea, it was a war of annihilation that produced casualties on a scale almost impossible to comprehend. When Germany launched Operation Barbarossa in June 1941, it triggered a 4-year struggle defined by brutal extremes. For the soldiers, the primary enemy was often the weather. German troops, unprepared for the Russian winter, faced temperatures of -40 degrees Fahrenheit. Rifles froze, tank engines failed to start, and thousands of men lost limbs to frostbite while wearing summer uniforms. The war was defined by massive urban sieges and industrial slaughter. In the Battle of Stalingrad, soldiers fought room to room in a ruined city. Sniper fire was constant, and entire divisions were ground to nothing in weeks. At Kursk, the largest tank battle in history, involved thousands of armored vehicles in a mechanical hellscape. Cruelty was systematic. Both sides treated prisoners of war with extreme brutality. Millions of Soviet POWs died of starvation in German camps, while German survivors faced years of forced labor in the Soviet gulags. By the time the Red Army captured Berlin in 1945, the Eastern Front had claimed more lives than all other theaters of World War II combined. It left behind a landscape of scorched earth and a demographic scar that lasts to this day. Total deaths: approximately 30 million people. Soviet losses: approximately 27 million people, including 8.7 million soldiers. World War II, the Pacific Theater. The Pacific Theater is often defined by island hopping. Spanning a massive ocean and thousands of remote islands, it was a campaign of brutal extremes that tested the limits of human endurance. When Japanese forces attacked Pearl Harbor in December 1941, it triggered the most expansive naval and aerial conflict in history. Within months, American, British, and Australian forces were locked in a desperate struggle to halt the Japanese advance across the Philippines, the East Indies, and the Solomon Islands. By 1943, the campaign settled into a grueling pattern of amphibious assaults. From the black sands of Iwo Jima to the dense jungles of Guadalcanal, Allied troops faced a no-surrender enemy in terrain that was as deadly as the combat itself. But the element that truly defined the Pacific War for many was the environment. In the jungles of New Guinea and the Philippines, soldiers faced sweltering heat and tropical diseases like malaria and dysentery that claimed as many lives as bullets. Conversely, during the later stages of the war in the North Pacific or the high-altitude bombing runs over Japan, crews faced bitter cold. However, the defining hell of the Pacific was the jungle warfare, where visibility was limited to a few feet and the humidity caused equipment to rot and skin to fester. The campaign culminated in 1945 with the largest sea-to-land invasions at Okinawa. Those who survived the kamikaze attacks and cave-by-cave fighting were the lucky ones. By the time the war ended in September 1945, following the atomic bombings and the formal surrender on the USS Missouri, the map of Asia had been entirely redrawn. The war ended with the total defeat of the Japanese Empire. 4 years of Pacific fighting, millions dead, a world forever changed. Military deaths, approximately 161,000 Americans in the Pacific, plus millions of Japanese, Chinese, and Allied soldiers. World War I, the Great War. For the soldiers who served in the Great War, the conflict began with a march into the mud of the Western Front and ended in a world that had been shattered forever. Everything in between was the trench. The terrain of World War I was a desolate landscape of craters and barbed wire. For miles, the earth was carved into deep, narrow trenches where soldiers lived for weeks at a time. Visibility was often blocked by thick fog or the terrifying clouds of poison gas. Temperatures plummeted in the winter, turning the ground into a freezing, knee-deep sludge that never seemed to dry. Rats infested the dugouts, and lice were a constant plague. Soldiers suffered from trench foot, a painful condition where feet literally began to rot from being submerged in cold water for days. Then there was the constant threat of artillery. Shell shock became the defining psychological wound of a generation. And then there was no man's land. The space between opposing trenches was a killing field of machine gun fire and hidden mines. An attack meant climbing over the top into a hail of lead, often only to gain a few yards of dirt. There was no safety. Even in the rear, long-range heavy guns could strike at any moment. Between 1914 and 1918, new technologies like tanks, airplanes, and chemical weapons changed warfare forever. Mustard gas burned the lungs and blinded those it didn't kill, leaving survivors with lifelong respiratory struggles. When it finally ended in 1918 with an armistice, a lost generation returned to a map of the world that had been completely redrawn. The physical and psychological scars remained for a lifetime. U.S. military deaths, approximately 116,516. Total deaths, all nations, approximately 15 to 20 million.
The Iran-Iraq War, one of the longest and deadliest conventional wars of the 20th century. The Iran-Iraq War began when Saddam Hussein ordered Iraqi forces to invade Iran, seeking to seize oil-rich territory and stop the spread of the Islamic Revolution. The war quickly devolved into a brutal war of attrition. Much like World War I, the conflict was defined by vast networks of trenches, barbed wire, and human wave attacks. For 8 years, soldiers on both sides lived in the mud and dust, fighting over small patches of desert that changed hands repeatedly. The environment was punishing. Temperatures in the border marshes and deserts often soared above 115 degrees Fahrenheit, causing widespread heat exhaustion. In the southern marshes, soldiers fought in waist-deep water infested with mosquitoes and disease. The war was also marked by horrific modern atrocities. Iraq extensively used chemical weapons, including mustard gas and nerve agents, against both Iranian soldiers and Kurdish civilians. This left thousands with permanent lung damage and skin blisters that never truly healed. Meanwhile, the War of the Cities saw both nations launch ballistic missiles at each other's capitals, bringing the terror of the front lines directly to civilians. When a ceasefire was finally brokered in 1988, the borders returned exactly to where they had started. 8 years of fighting resulted in no territorial gain for either side, only a shattered landscape and a massive loss of life. Estimated total deaths between 1 million and 2 million people, including soldiers and civilians. Napoleon's invasion of Russia. In June 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte led his Grande Armée of over 600,000 men into Russia. It was the largest invasion force ever assembled in Europe, but it was walking into a trap of geography and climate. The campaign began in sweltering summer heat, but the Russian army refused to engage in a decisive battle. Instead, they used a scorched earth policy, retreating deeper into the interior while burning crops and poisoning wells to leave the French with no supplies. By the time Napoleon reached Moscow in September, the city was deserted and soon engulfed in flames. He waited 5 weeks for a surrender that never came, while his supplies dwindled and the infamous Russian winter approached. The retreat was a catastrophe. Temperatures plummeted to -22 degrees Fahrenheit. French soldiers, still dressed in summer uniforms, died by the thousands from hypothermia and starvation. Exhausted men fell asleep in the snow and never woke up. Horses died in such numbers that the cavalry had to walk, and the army was constantly harassed by Cossack raiders. The crossing of the Berezina River was the final blow, where thousands drowned in the icy water as bridges collapsed under the weight of panicked troops. When the remnants finally escaped Russia, the Grand Army had been reduced to a ghost of its former self. Of the 600,000 who entered, fewer than 100,000 returned. Estimated deaths, over 400,000 French and Allied soldiers, mostly from cold and disease rather than combat. The Vietnam War. For the American soldiers who served in Vietnam, the war was defined not by trenches but by the jungle. It was a conflict where there was no clear front line, and the environment was as much an enemy as the opposing forces. The terrain was a nightmare of dense triple canopy rainforest, where visibility was often limited to just a few feet. Temperatures regularly soared above 100 degrees Fahrenheit with suffocating humidity. Soldiers carried 60-pound packs through waist-deep mud and across rivers infested with mosquitoes and disease. The war was defined by guerrilla warfare. The Viet Cong utilized vast underground tunnel networks to launch ambushes and disappear before U.S. forces could strike back. Because of this, soldiers lived in a state of constant paranoia. Snipers, booby traps, and punji stakes made every step a potential death sentence. In an attempt to strip away the jungle cover, the U.S. military sprayed millions of gallons of Agent Orange. While it cleared the forests, the dioxin in the herbicide caused devastating long-term health issues for both Vietnamese civilians and U.S. veterans. The war ended in 1975 with the fall of Saigon. For many veterans, the return home was as painful as the combat, as they were met with a divided nation and a lack of public support. U.S. military deaths, 58,220. Total deaths, including civilians, estimated between 1.3 million and 3.5 million. The Korean War. Often called the Forgotten War, the Korean War was a brutal conflict sandwiched between World War II and Vietnam. It began in June 1950 when North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel, triggering a rapid military escalation involving American, South Korean, Chinese, and UN forces. The war was defined by extreme shifts in momentum. It started with a fast-moving war of maneuver, but soon settled into a grinding stalemate by 1951. For the soldiers, it became a war of trenches and artillery duels over rugged hills that cost thousands of lives for just a few yards of ground. The defining element of the Korean War was the bitter cold. During the Battle of Choson Reserve in late 1950, temperatures dropped to -35 degrees Fahrenheit. Weapons jammed, morphine froze in syringes, and blood plasma became useless in IV bags. Soldiers suffered horrific frostbite, losing fingers and toes before even engaging the enemy. The war ended in 1953 with a ceasefire or armistice rather than a formal peace treaty. The border ended up almost exactly where it began, leaving the peninsula divided to this day. U.S. military deaths approximately 36,574. Total military deaths over 1 million, including South Korean, North Korean, and Chinese forces.